So I have this ferment that I call my adventure ferment, and I started it in 2019. And it like so everywhere I travel in the world, I bring some of it. And it's like pickle brine, and so it's just like, and these pickles are like, they seriously. I opened the jar and I'm like, I can smell like all like the time I was in Iceland, the time I went to this one place in Florida, the way like it like smells like all of those trips to me. Like it's really cool.
Welcome to Power Dining, the podcast that wrangles up wild bacteria to cultivate culture, both biologically and anthropologically. I'm your host, Kaylani Palmisano, and with me today is Julia Skinner, an all-around expert in the world of ferments. Julia is a food historian, fermentation specialist, as well as a teacher and social science researcher. With her doctorate in information studies, much of her work centers on food as a powerful tool in developing human connection and memory. Her recently published book, Our Fermented Lives A History, How Fermented Foods Have Shaped Cultures and Communities, dives deep into the power of ferments. Whenever I think of ferments, that scene from Portlandia where Fred Armisen and Carrie Brownstein keep repeating, "We could pickle that, we could pickle that," as things that they're trying to pickle get progressively stranger and stranger. I love this joke because in reality, like you can pickle a lot of things, but also fermented foods are so prevalent in cultures across a large portion of human history. So, Julia, when we talk about ferments, what are we talking about?
So we're talking about. I really like the definition that Sandor Katz uses of fermentation as the transformative action of microbes, because it allows us to think about just how broad the subject is. So, anything from beer to bread to wine to cheese to vanilla to cocoa to like all of these different things, sauerkraut, all fermented in different ways, and so it's a global history of foods that have been transformed.
There's a lot in there that I think people don't expect to be fermented either. Like there's a process in the chocolate making process that calls for fermentation. And even, does coffee need fermentation as well?
Yes, yeah. So coffee, black tea is fermented. Yeah, all kinds of things.
It's very surprising. But how did you get into fermentation?
So I started fermenting food, oh gosh, it would have been about 2 decades ago now. And so I had a garden. I was pretty broke, as many of us are in our early 20s. And so I had a garden and was growing some of my own food to try to save some money. And I, like every gardener has this happen, right? All of your whatever comes ripe at the same time. And then in my case, I was a bunch of cabbages and a bunch of like radishes and stuff. And I was like, what am I going to do with all of this? Um, and one of my friends was like, well, why don't you just make sauerkraut? And I was like, I guess I can do that. And yeah, it's been a nonstop journey ever since.
What are some of the major roles ferments have played in establishing civilizations?
Well, I mean, one of the big things I like to point people to is that ferments really help provide food security. So if you're able to preserve fresh vegetables and fruits, um, and to continue to have the nutrients from them even when those things are not growing, that helps you and your community stay healthy and alive. And fermentation is one of the many preservation strategies we've employed. Fermentation also provides, it's good for us too. So it's physically nourishing, and so you're getting a very healthy preserve as well.
There were, even in your book, there were a lot of examples of like the health benefits throughout history. And I was really struck by beer and its ability to prevent scurvy.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting researching the book because I had heard the thing that I think a lot of us have of like beer, like people drinking beer because the water sources weren't safe, and fermenting the beer helped make the water safer. So I knew that that was a thing, but yeah, I didn't know that people were drinking it to actually get vitamins and things too. But yeah, they are, and like B vitamins as well. Like people people will drink beer to get B vitamins. It's kind of an interesting thing.
So, your book, not only is your book about ferments, it's also about the symbiotic relationship between how fermented foods and culture are related and how they shape one another. My favorite chapter, and the one that we're going to discuss in a lot of, is the one on community. There are so many fascinating examples about how ferments have the power to influence all aspects of culture, and how they quote in your book, you have a quote in there that says, have knit communities closer together and also torn them apart. What are some things in your research that really surprised you when it came to this chapter?
I mean, I think one thing that surprised me was, or maybe didn't surprise me, but the extent of it surprised me was the ways in which some ferments were very like associated with status and class and all of these things. So there's this really interesting book called The Billionaire's Vinegar, and it's about like this really expensive bottle of wine and kind of tracing the story of this wine. And this guy spends all this money on it, and then it's and then like displays it, but in so doing compromises the wine itself. And so it's like this kind of interesting metaphor for like using something that's supposed to be a consumed and shared, food stuff as purely a status symbol. So, and wine, I think, is something that's used in that way a lot.
And it still kind of is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people tie prestige to specific regions, even though there are a lot of newer regions that are emerging that can produce just as high a quality of product or even a more unique product than, say, like, I mean, I don't want to knock Burgundy or Champagne or like those, tried and true like regions. But I mean, I would argue that Argentinian wines can compete with a lot of European wines, or even New Zealand wines
Mhm.
are. I would say New Zealand. That's the only Pinot Noir in the world that I am willing to drink because I'm not a big Pinot Noir person. But the ones from down there, they're delicious. They're amazing. And I love how, as part of the terroir, they talk about how there's like whale and penguin bones just because of how, I guess, like the geology is down there. That's actually part of the terroir in New Zealand wines.
Fascinating. Yeah, I guess my approach to wine, is like so much less about status and more about like, I haven't tried this thing before. I want to try it. Like, there's so many different wines out there. And yeah, I mean, again, like, I love Burgundies and Champagnes. And like, yes, I will absolutely drink those. But yeah, like, I also want to try, like, oh, this like wine. I had a wine when I was in Scotland last. It was like, I think it was from like Venezuela. And I was like, I didn't even know that that was like a wine option. And like, and it was
Yeah.
really good.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, it's getting outside of the expectations bubble that we kind of put ourselves
Mhm.
into. But yeah, what are some ways that ferments are integrated into religion and rituals?
So, I mean, I think, again, if we think about wine and mead, I think a lot of beverages like that, there's kind of this idea of, in some parts of Christianity, of kind of the transubstantiation and, the symbolism of bread also fermented, and wine as being, body and blood of Christ. So there's that. Um, there's also, if we look at like Viking rituals, there's mead as a part of that. But it's what I found most interesting was the ways in which these appeared in some of the stories themselves. So, for example, in the Viking mead of poetry and inspiration, the reason why we have these very critical components to like what we consider central to our humanity, our creativity, our ability to express ourselves, um, in this legend that comes from this like mead from the gods that then humans consumed and then were able to express these gifts.
There's even a little bit about grief pickles and other types of funeral foods.
Yeah. Yeah, funeral foods are really interesting. And I found the grief pickles. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's in the compiled volume Eat Joy. Um, and it's, yeah, it resonated so much with me because I think we all have had like those moments of like, I need to create something. Like, I'm in this big upset state and I need to like make a thing to kind of help me work through that. And in both of our cases, pickles are the thing that
Oh.
like all like I've had so many, well, not like so many times, it's not like this happens regularly, but it has happened in the past where I've also, done a similar, like, I'm processing a difficult thing and so I'm gonna just like pickle whatever, and then it's like kind of this marker of both that moment and of also the fact that you like kind of found a way to cope your way through it.
Mm.
So when you engage with it later, it's like, oh, like I would expect the grief pickles to make me really sad, but they're actually like a kind of hopeful thing. So it's kind of cool.
That's a beautiful sentiment, and I have a couple of thoughts there. I interviewed a friend of mine a while ago. She wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal. Her name's Amory Dooling, and she's Italian American. And she wrote an article about this concept called dolce far niente, the sweetness of nothing. And she kind of talked about the mental health benefits of allowing your mind these moments to wander, just so things like sitting out on your porch and people watching, or just but one of her big examples was chopping up food, that actually making a meal that has kind of repetitive processes put to it. So chopping up vegetables in the pickling sense, putting it into a brine or preparing it however you will. I feel like in moments when I don't have much mental capacity, sometimes doing something that is relatively easy, and fermenting relatively is,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it soothes the heart and soul, and it also makes me feel like I've completed something, because at the end of it, I have a physical product. It's almost like puzzles are another thing that I like to do if I'm not feeling down, because it's structured, but you're putting something together, and at the end you can actually visibly see your progress. And with pickles, you set them, or with like lactobacilla, is that the proper pronunciation, lactobacilla fermentation,
Um,
or lacto
yeah,
fermentation?
you can say lactic acid fermentation or lactobacillus, or
Okay. With
yeah.
Yeah, with lactic acid fermentation, you just kind of put your veggies there, and you can see it progress over time as the bubbles form, or you taste it, and as it becomes more sour. And my other point, as it pertains to pickling in times of grief, it's almost like pickling is this moment in time. And I know for myself, in traumatic events that I've experienced in my life, that first year feels very, very hard, because you're always comparing to the time before. But once you reach that 1 year mark, you suddenly realize how far you've come from where that moment happened, or when the grief kind of started. And I don't know, that's just my thought of maybe those pickles are this moment in time where you can reflect and see how far you've come.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up an interesting point because for me, when I've had traumatic experiences, there's also that sense, like you said, like it's kind of hard to tell where you are in time. So you're like very unmoored. And I find that making so I do a lot of wild fermentation with seasonal ingredients. So I have like on this shelf back here, I have some vinegar I made with some chickweed from my yard. Like that vinegar tastes like springtime at my house. And so, like, in doing that, I've found that to be very helpful and like grounding for me, especially if I'm just like all over the place. Yeah, it kind of brings me back to being like, okay, you made this. This speaks to time and place. Like you're here. It's this time. Like it's okay. You're making progress. You're moving forward. Like it's yeah. It really kind of helps like mark those moments really well.
Oh, I love that idea of pickling and fermenting, kind of connecting you to place and time. And we see that in your book, where pickling is this tradition that also brings people together. I think you talk about with kimchi and how people come together and make kimchi. What's that gathering called again?
Kim Jong. I might be slightly mispronouncing it, so I apologize to listeners if I am. But yeah, it's basically a gathering of, sometimes it's families, sometimes it's community members. It kind of just depends on your particular group. But yeah, people come together in the fall and just make all of this kimchi. A number of people I've talked to have talked about how they also make extra for neighbors who maybe don't have a lot of money. And so, like, those people are also able to stay fed through the winter as well.
No, it's connection to one another, connection to your culture and your traditions. I like, and I feel like every family has their own recipes or ideas of how kimchi or a lot of ferments should be
Mhm.
made, and so therefore every family's kimchi kind of tastes a little bit different than another's. There, it's kind of similar to a lot of families in Mexico having their own mezcal
Mhm.
recipes, that there's so many different kinds, and they taste differently, and they're made during different seasons, they're made with different batches, but also that these families will get together and they'll make it for special occasions, so for weddings or for other milestones. And in Italy, in Modena, I've heard of the tradition of making balsamic vinegar, how fathers will make a batch of balsamic vinegar when their daughters are born, and then kind of add it to their dowry when they're ready to get married, because by then it's kind of done fermenting.
Oh wow. Yeah, I find it so fascinating how we have so many, it's something I talked about a lot in the book, and it's something, I focus on a lot kind of in my own curiosity, is just how we have like so many like community focused aspects to fermentation, like whether it be that like familial kind of like your family's traditions or your town's traditions, or like, hey, we're making extra for the guy down the street because he can't afford to like buy his own ingredients, or like whatever it is. Like there's like so many different ways that we use ferments for sharing and caring for each other.
There, I do like that idea of this radical sovereignty of fermenting foods, where you can grow your own foods or forage foods, and as long as you know how to wrangle up that wild bacteria, you can preserve the foods and its nutrients for extended periods of time. And there's a little part of wild crafting in your
Hmm.
book, and you also mentioned getting things from your own yard and from
Hmm.
your own garden. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so I think, there's wildcrafting for me goes hand in hand with kind of my philosophy of fermentation and food preservation in general, which is with fermentation in particular, we're talking about something really special because you don't need a lot of specialized equipment. The process is pretty simple. Like, if I want to ferment, let's say sauerkraut, or something similar, I need some salt. I need like a jar or a crock or whatever, my cabbage, and then like a couple weeks of time. And like that's it. Like I don't need to like go out and buy a bunch of stuff. I don't need to like I just kind of can have these simple ingredients. And so for me, especially when we're talking about like food insecurity, food deserts, things like that, fermentation is a really powerful way for us to reduce food waste and to help people kind of preserve their food and get the most nutrients out of it. And wild crafting, for me, I find it very rewarding, both because you're out in nature and you're kind of connecting with these plants, and it really helps you like get such a deep appreciation for them. But like, it's also a way, like when I teach people how to identify wild foods, like that person then has like another tool in their toolbox to feed themselves. There's something that Pascal Bauder said. I can't. I think it was in one of his books, but Pascal Bowder, or sorry, it was on Instagram, somewhere.
It was
He
published
said,
somewhere.
it was somewhere. I definitely saw it. That he said that, like, so garlic mustard, which is an invasive species, he's like, it's so interesting that we have these invasive species that are edible, and our response tends to be to just kind of like carpet bomb them out of existence and cause all this ecological damage while we're like, spraying Roundup or whatever all over these things. And he's like, so he was looking at it through the lens of food waste. And so he's like, what if, like, he's like, there's so many hungry people. Like, what if we like actually had people gather this stuff and then distribute it or eat it? Like, make it so that this food isn't being wasted, but we're also dealing with the ecological problem of an invasive plant. And so
Mm-hmm.
I like to think a lot about like kind of that sort of mindset of like, how am I helping support my community and reduce food waste? How does my approach to like stewarding wild plants engage with that?
There's also, you talked about, and this is reflective in multiple cultures of how brewing, like beer making and wine making, are almost led by religious leaders. So in Japan, brewing sake, there was a period in time where it was done in shrines and temples. And then in European monasteries, they were the ones tasked with brewing beer and wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in abbeys too. And I think it's interesting because we have like it shows kind of the centrality of these ferments to our cultures and our communities, that like they were so connected with the sacred, both in like the storytelling, like we were talking about, like the Viking mead, but then also in like the actual production. And with beer, I think it's interesting because we think a lot about like, the Trappist beers and like these beers made by these monks, but there were a lot of nuns making beer too. And then there was also a lot of just like people outside of those institutions also fermenting beer. So you had the alewives. I think it's a very interesting story of these women who, like, this was their way to be financially independent in a very, very patriarchal, constricting culture. And so a lot of them, when men were like, hey, we're interested in brewing now, and we would like to set up guilds, and you can't do this anymore. Um, they kind of basically did like the smear campaign against these women that like framed them as witches. So you kind of have this other religious element coming in there too, of like, oh, these women are scary, bad witches. Like, you can't buy their beer, it's evil. Like, so like when we have like the symbols of like the women with like the hats and the cats and everything and the broom, that all actually comes from alewives in that brewing history, and like how they dressed, and they had cats around to keep rats away from their grain stores, and like, yeah.
That is fascinating to understand the context of the kind of division of the gender roles over time, that it was a lot of women doing brewing, and then over time we turned into witches.
Yep.
And just as ferments have the power to bring us together, you talk a lot about how ferments can also divide us and create social hierarchies. So we talked a little bit about how people treat certain wines, how putting wines on display, or how people become enamored with certain labels of things. And we talked a little bit about the alewives and how brewing was really a woman's job and evolved over time to a very male dominated thing, which in some ways it is, but also I'm glad to see that more women are entering the field of winemaking and brewing and distilling. But there's also a part in your book man's baking. There was this concept of man's baking by monks in the 8th century Ireland versus the value of women's baking. And that did actually bring up a really interesting concept of how do we value women's work versus men's work. And there's an author that you quoted. It was author and archaeologist Morgan Smith. She explained it as the terms may then be seen as referring first to the secular sphere. The women's loaves as bread making was predominantly a female task pertaining to ordinary domestic needs, but men's loaves belonging to more professional production, consistent with the male monastic communities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's just like any of the other ferments that, we might talk about. I mean, we have like women have done so much to feed our communities and to feed our families for millennia. And it's so, if I'm doing the exact same thing as a man, it's somehow less valuable, even though I'm doing, like I'm doing, you know, either probably just as well of a job or like probably a better job because like I've like done it more and just it's not
Exactly.
been
Yeah.
acknowledged.
You're more of an expert in it that it's almost like it's just expected of you. That's the thing you should be doing. But then when a
Yeah,
man does it, it's an event.
right. Like,
There needs
whoa,
to be
this
a
guy made this.
parade.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it ties into something else I talk in the book about, which is this like whose stories are the stories we save. And like so in the book I talk a lot about how like okay, like I've gathered up what I can to like here based on like the various constraints of like what's written down and what, I have access to and like all of that. But like also recognizing there's so many fermentation stories we've lost because so many of these foods were made by people who weren't considered worth talking about and worth saving their stories. And so it's kind of like it's a soapbox I get on all the time, but I'm going to get on it again.
It's something that we need to hear. Yeah, absolutely.
Of like this idea of like that we are the stewards now of like what will become history later on. And so like when we record and save our stories and we share our stories and we don't just let somebody else dictate what information is going to be saved about us and our culture and our family and our community, like that makes it so like the next me that comes along and writes a book like this in I don't know 100 years or whenever somebody decides to write another fermentation history, they will have like more information to be able to do that. They'll be able to tell a bigger, richer story because they'll have more voices they can add to it.
And with certain traditions being erased in history, there's one hopeful story that you mentioned, which is Nearest Green and how he was the first distiller of the Jack Daniels distillery.
Yeah, and he was, like Jack Daniels really kind of didn't give him any credit at all.
Right.
I mean, like, as is, often the story with that. And, but yeah, so now there's the actual Nearest Green, like whiskey that is made that like his, his story was uncovered. Like there's, the distiller, of Uncle Nearest, like she went out and she like uncovered the story and she's like, no, we are going to honor this person with a whiskey named after him. Like he did the work. He deserves to be honored in this way as well. And like
Absolutely. And to
and
clarify,
it's really good.
this was a black man who was a distiller uh, for Jack Daniels as that business was starting. And as history rolled on, Jack Daniels kind of took credit for the recipe and for his work.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's extra critical because we're talking about you know, so Nathan Green, Nearest, Uncle
Mhm.
Nearest, was this. So we're talking about the 1850s in Tennessee. So we're not only talking about a black man, we're talking about an enslaved person,
Right.
somebody whose story can be completely wiped out. very easily. And so,
So it was Fawn Weaver who unearthed this history.
yeah, and who really kind of made it her mission to recenter Uncle Nearest within the story of American whiskey, because like he is responsible for so much of what we think of as bourbon.
What I really love about this story is when Nearest Green came to light, people started to realize that the Lincoln County process, which is the charcoal filtering technique that is indicative of Tennessee whiskey, that's what makes it unique to Tennessee. Um, it's a process that likely comes from West Africa, where the charcoal filtering technique is used for cooking as well as filtering liquids.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating, and it's like again why it's so important to like, think about where our food comes from and who actually made it. Like so much of southern food, like, as we now know, thanks to the work of Michael Twitty and so many other, Lenny Sorensen and all these other folks, like and Tony Tipton Martin, like so much of it comes from African and African American traditions. Like that is really at the core of what the food here is. Yeah, I mean, there's another example that isn't in the U.S., but in this hemisphere or in this side of the world that comes to mind, which is in Bahia in
Mhm.
Brazil. There's acarajé, and it's one of their important foods there, and they're basically a fermented black-eyed pea fritter. I love them; they're like so delicious. But they're actually based, so acarajé are actually based on akara, which is a West
Mhm.
African fermented black-eyed pea fritter. And so, but it's like become really entrenched in this other space, and it's such a clear example of how these African food traditions were brought across the Middle Passage, and people took pains to preserve them, even while being stripped of their culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating to learn so much about how in diasporic communities the traditions and the flavors that are tied to this fermentation process, whether it be the charcoal filtering or the what was it, the black eyed peas, the
Mm-hmm.
akajara,
Akara, yeah.
Akara, with Akara, and how those culinary traditions survived the resilience that it needed, and also the strength of the community to continue to carry on those traditions, so that people can connect to it even when they were far away from home.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other stories about communities moving around and carrying their ferments with them. I think you talk about sauerkraut in
Mm-hmm.
your book.
Yeah, so sauerkraut is interesting because, as far as anyone knows, the story of sauerkraut actually comes from Mongolia. And so when um, soldiers invaded Eastern Europe from Mongolia, they had cabbage they had pickled in rice wine vinegar, and that was their pickled cabbage. But so they brought this to Central Europe, and people were like, "Wow, this is good." I mean, obviously there was a lot more going on than "Wow, this cabbage is good," but like for the sake of
Right.
this
For the sake
conversation,
for to be succinct, yes.
um, the cabbage in whatever way stayed in Eastern European culture. And so, but they didn't have rice wine vinegar necessarily, so they pickled it with salt instead. And the salt draws the liquid out of the cabbage, and that's how you make the brine that ferments it. So, yeah, it's like people traveling with these foods and bringing them to new places. I know people that will like move between places and bring their starters with them. Like I have starters in my house that are decades old that I've moved across the country, and like all that I would like never get rid of. Yeah, like you really like you grow a connection not only with the food tradition, but like with the actual cultures themselves. Like it's like, this is my starter. These are my pals.
I love starter stories and where they originate and when people share them. There's a bagel shop in South Philly called Korshak Bagels,
Hmm.
and the bagel maestro behind the operation has every bagel is born from this one starter, and this starter started over a decade ago as a starter for a cake that he made for his mom or something that he baked for his mom. So
Oh.
it had like Granny Smith apples in it, and you, as you smell it, you could just smell the adventures that this
Hmm.
starter went on. He lived in Austin, Texas at one point. He traveled across the country through the Badlands with it, and he also went to like Montreal bagel shops. And he said that he walked into a bagel shop and just opened the jar and just let the wild yeast
Yep.
kind of mingle with his sourdough starter. It's like you touch an ancient relic and suddenly everything flashes
Yeah.
before your eyes of everywhere that ferment has been. That's so cool. So
Yes.
that's just so that's not a sourdough starter. That is just a jar of brine.
It's a jar of brine that I swap out, so I'll put in I do carrots a lot because like if I'm gone for a couple weeks, like carrots like it's not gonna like get weird and moldy. Like carrots are pretty resilient. Um Kind of whatever vegetables I throw in there and I just swap the vegetables out, every week or two and, eat them. um Yeah, but it's like this brine is just like I actually I split it across two jars because I got paranoid about it. I was like, what if I drop one and then I won't have my jar anymore? So now I have like most people back up their computers, which I also do, but I also back up this one ferment.
That is so funny. Wait, so when you travel with this, do you have to check it? Do you have to put it in one of those flight safe packages or jars, or do you check it in a bag?
So, I when I travel with it, I usually will put it in a dropper bottle and put it in that little like quart Ziploc, with my like shampoo and stuff, and then I'll just like
Genius.
take it out and like open it and like set it out wherever I am, or I'll
Oh,
like
yes.
add like some water from like a local water source or something,
Oh,
and I'll like
that's so
add
cool.
little bits of like pine needles and things to it. Like it's like it kind of just gets stuff thrown in it throughout the trip, and then I bring it home and then
One
add it
that
back to the
that
mainland.
is that has to be one of the coolest travel souvenirs I've ever heard of, and now I'm inspired. I want to
You should do it.
have that. Is such a fun project. I don't know if this is part of other Amish communities, but there is a little tradition in Pennsylvania Dutch country called Amish friendship bread. And so the idea is you make a starter, and over the course of 10 days, you build it and you squeeze the baggie, you mix it around, and every day has this process. And it's 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, you feed it, you make your loaf, and it's enough to make 3 loaves. So, and then you have enough starter to pass on. And the whole idea is that you give one to two, you have two to give to two friends at the end of it. So I love those kinds of sharing stories. But back to
Yeah.
sauerkraut, I loved this point that was made of there's a tradition of stomping on sauerkraut, which I didn't know. I mean, I knew about pressing it into
Hmm.
the jar. I have like a, I don't know what you would call it, just whatever fits into my bell jar, and I can
Yeah.
stamp it down. But they are actually stomping on it with their feet, and they someone said in the book that the stomping on the sauerkraut hits a European collective nostalgia.
Yeah, and it's something I've never uh been like in person witness to sauerkraut stomping. It sounds super fun, but it's like, I mean, very much like wine stomping or something. It's like, okay, well, we've got all this stuff that we need to take from being, in this solid state of fruit or vegetable into a more not solid state. and and the easiest way to do that, pre a lot of machinery. I mean, I guess you could like set up some complicated, machinery to do it, but why not just have everybody kind of the most low tech, easiest way is just for everybody to get together and just step on their food.
Your book, Our Fermented Lives, is such a fun educational book. It really feels like it could have the potential to be a textbook too, which you could definitely form an entire course curriculum on just ferments and its impact on culture. It's such a fascinating book. How long did it take you to do it?
Let's see. I think it took about 2 years to write. Yeah, so it came out end of last year. So I started on it in earnest a handful of months before lockdown, and then I was doing
Mm.
the recipe testing right at lockdown. So I was like going around when all the grocery store shelves were empty,
Oh
trying
my
to find the
gosh.
ingredients to like make the recipes in
A
this
new
book.
added challenge to the mix. Yeah.
It was quite a gauntlet. Like that was probably the hardest part of writing the book, was just like trying to find, like, I don't know, like green papayas or black eyed peas or something when like all the store shelves are empty.
Was there a favorite recipe of yours?
It's interesting. So there's 42 of them, and I love them all. It's kind of I feel like my favorite switches kind of depending on the season. So the mushroom ketchup I really like, especially in the fall. It's kind of like a Worcestershire-esque situation. Like is really good. And like, but has like some spice in it, so it's like really good in like fall kind of warming dishes. Tapache, which is a pineapple beverage. So
People got
good.
hot on tapache over the
They
pandemic.
did.
People
Yeah.
were really into, the reducing the food waste because it really gave us that Great Depression mentality of like, I gotta
Yeah.
store things, I have to can things, I have to, yeah. Tapache is so good.
Yeah, it's so good. And like, yeah, I mean, Tapache, kind of going back to that, like I teach like low waste cooking classes and stuff. And I like that was never more popular than it was during like lockdown. Like more people bought that class like during that 1 month than like any other month, because people
Oh,
were just like, "Oh
everybody
God, I got
had,
to do this."
yeah, everybody had victory gardens. It was
Yeah,
on.
it was. Yeah, there was a lot. There was a lot going on there.
I was I was actually regrowing Target brand black beans.
Yeah, yeah. No, we all made a lot of interesting gardening and culinary choices during that time.
And I hope that people continue that education and explore it more. I was one of the sourdough people who got my sourdough starter from my brother in law, who got it from
Mhm.
a really popular bakery in Philadelphia. And I have it running now almost like 2.5 years. But I got into just the regular lacto acid
Mhm.
fermentation, which was mind-bogglingly easy. So I
Super
think a
easy.
great place, if anyone is trying to get into fermenting anything, I think a great place to start is just the lacto acid fermentation, where you just submerge some vegetables. I used to do
Mhm.
radishes and onions together. That was really delicious. Cauliflower with some curry powder. Like if you want to add some flavor to it, you just put a little scoop in
Yeah.
there at the bottom and then just let it sit. Attempted sauerkraut. I have to return to it though because I think I used way too much salt. It was so terrible. I did not measure things properly.
I mean,
um,
it's forgiving, but within
yeah.
limits.
And I think it'll progress. I think my next one that I would like to attempt is mead. I know that sounds
Yeah.
very basic and cliche, but I want to try mead.
So actually, it's interesting you say that because I have mead right behind me. So yeah,
Stop.
like mead can be, and this is what I love about mead is like you can be as complex and like home brewery about it as you want, right? Like some
Right.
people have like whole setups with like all the tubes and the siphoning and the whatever. So this is a jar of honey that had some honey in the bottom, and I dumped water in it and shook it up.
Ooh. That's it?
And yeah, I mean, like I shake it every day, and I like open the lid just to like make sure there's not like pressure building up. But it's like it smells like mead. Like it's definitely boozy. It's
Wow.
11 in the morning, or I would drink some of it. But like it's like, yeah, like it's literally like it can be that easy. Like this is what I do with every time I have just like the honey in the bottom of a jar is all just like add some water and shake it and then make mead.
My mind is blown. I am so excited to try it. And the reason I wanted to try mead, in terms of brewing, it seemed as though it was one of the lowest risk, easiest entry points to get into brewing, because I feel like beer brewing is a little bit more intense, a lot more precise. Winemaking, no, I don't have the capacity to. I don't have a vineyard anywhere. But mead just seemed easy enough, and honey is just such a fascinating ingredient anyway.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah.
yeah, like mead's so cool because like everything you need is in the honey. Like there's the yeast, there's the sugars, there's like, it's just like, hey, I want to become this. Like, please just add water to me.
One question that I have
Mhm.
is I like fermenting when my veggies are about to go, because it gives them more leg. And when you were saying, oh, reducing the food waste, if veggies, if I didn't get around to cooking them, just pickling them actually
Mhm.
kind of revives them. What's the brink? What is the point at which that you shouldn't pickle veggies that are on the brink of going bad?
I mean, I'd say if they're covered in mold, obviously I wouldn't. I think, otherwise, as long as they're like, if they're just wilty, I will just maybe alter what I might do to them. So infused vinegar, so like fire cider, which I also have over there, in this pile of stuff back here. I will put like my wilted veggies and stuff in my fire cider as a way to like make this medicinal vinegar and also reduce waste. And so like maybe instead of eating them as pickles, I'm using it as a flavoring or another component. You can also if you pickle them and they're like really mushy or something, throw those in a dehydrator and then grind it up, and then you have like a seasoning powder, and then you don't have to throw them away.
Oh my goodness. Awesome tips. I love it. Thank you. I'm a subscriber of your Substack, but it's Roots Kitchen, right?
Root Kitchens
Oh, Root
at
Kitchen.
Substack, yeah.
Cool. What's the URL so people could find it?
Yeah, it's rootkitchens.substack.com.
Awesome. And where else can people find your work?
So on social media, I'm at Bookish Julia, a nod to when I was a librarian, and at Root Kitchens. They can go to my website, which is root-kitchens.com. Those are probably the easiest places.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a really fascinating conversation of how powerful ferments really are in our lives.
Well, thank you again for having me.
You can follow Power Dining on Substack as well as on Instagram at Power Dining. Every other week, I'll have guest experts, chefs, and food lovers on the show to delve deeper into everything from the complex relationships we have with food to its impact on us and the world. If you're interested in extended interviews, bonus episodes, and more, consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Power Dining Substack. You can follow Power Dining on Substack as well as on Instagram at Power Dining. Every other week, I'll have guest experts, chefs, and food lovers on the show to delve deeper into everything from the complex relationships we have with food to its impact on us and the world. If you're interested in extended interviews, bonus episodes, and more, consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Power Dining Substack. Power Dining is hosted by yours truly, Keilani Palmisano. The music at the beginning and the end of this podcast is Who Do You Think I Think You Are by Mini Vandals. At the moment, I'm working as a one-woman band, producing, editing, and bringing these stories to your ears. So if you're liking what you're listening to, be sure to subscribe. You can also support me by engaging with the show and following me at Keilani Says, that's Kaelani Says, Says, on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Until next time, bye for now.